There are neighborhoods that breathe serenity into you the moment you drive through them, the kind of places where houses look like they've been copied and pasted from a magazine spread, where lawns seem greener than nature intended, and where the air itself feels carefully curated to give the illusion of perfection. Ours was one of those neighborhoods. At least, that's what everyone believed when they passed by, looking at our gated entrance with admiration and maybe a little envy. But perfection is often a mask, and behind that mask, cracks always wait to show themselves. I had chosen this neighborhood because of its promise of safety. My daughter, Emma, needed it. She was born with cerebral palsy, and though her body sometimes betrayed her, her spirit was boundless. At 14 years old, she had the heart of an angel and a smile that could light up a dimly lit room. The world hadn't always been kind to her. Children her age often didn't know how to respond to her wheelchair or the careful slowness of her speech. But dogs understood her in ways that people often failed to. From the day we moved in, Emma had discovered a small group of strays that wandered near the wooded lot at the edge of the cul-de-sac. They weren't aggressive, just hungry, cautious, and yearning for scraps of kindness. While many homeowners saw them as pests, Emma saw them as friends. Every evening, as the sun dipped low and the street lamps flickered awake, she'd wheel herself to the edge of our driveway with a bag of food in her lap. The dogs would come padding out from the shadows, their tails wagging hesitantly, their eyes soft with gratitude. I would stand on the porch, my arms crossed against the evening breeze, watching her laugh as she scattered kibble and scraps of leftover chicken. The dogs always kept a respectful distance, as if they understood her fragility. They ate, wagged their tails, and retreated once their bellies were full. Emma would wave at them as though she were sending off dear friends, and then she'd turn to me, her face glowing with a sense of accomplishment no one could take from her. But someone tried. Her name was Karen. Of course, that wasn't her real name, but it's the one everyone whispered when she wasn't within earshot. She was the self-proclaimed queen of our homeowners association, a woman whose lips curled into disapproval at even the smallest deviation from her vision of neighborhood order. Her yard was pristine, her blinds always open just enough to peer through, and her voice carried across driveways like an unwelcome siren. I first noticed her when Emma fed the dogs one early evening. Karen stood across the street, her arms folded like a sentry guarding the gates of perfection. Her eyes tracked Emma's every movement. When our gazes met, she didn't smile. She simply shook her head, the disapproval etched into her frown as deeply as lines in stone. At first, I dismissed it. After all, what harm was there in a girl feeding a few hungry dogs? But in neighborhoods ruled by HOAs, harm was often defined not by logic, but by appearances. And to Karen, appearances were everything. Life carried on in this rhythm for several weeks. Emma fed the dogs. I kept watch. Karen stared. And though I felt the weight of her eyes, I refused to let them dim the joy Emma found in those small acts of kindness. There was something healing in those moments, something powerful in watching her give when the world had so often taken from her. Sometimes I would kneel beside her wheelchair and ask, "Why do you like feeding them so much, sweetheart?" She would shrug, her lips curling into that gentle smile of hers. "Because they're lonely. They don't have anyone. But if I feed them, they know they matter. Even just a little." How could I argue with that? The neighborhood, however, was not so forgiving. Whispers began to circulate. A neighbor 2 houses down casually mentioned to me that feeding strays only makes them stay longer. Another reminded me of the HOA rules regarding animals, how pets had to be leashed, registered, and confined to backyards. None of them directly confronted me, but their words carried the echo of Karen's voice. She was stirring the pot, planting seeds of discontent one conversation at a time. Emma, blissfully unaware of the politics swirling around her, continued her nightly ritual. Her laughter drifted across the cul-de-sac, mingling with the barking of the strays. She named them, too. The shaggy brown mutt was Rusty. The sleek black one with a cautious step was Shadow. And the small white terrier mix, timid yet eager, was Snowball. To her, they weren't nuisances, they were family. One evening, I caught Karen lingering longer than usual. She stood just beyond the glow of the street lamp, her phone raised as if snapping pictures. I felt the prickle of irritation but held my tongue. Instead, I walked down the driveway and approached her calmly. "Is there something I can help you with?" I asked, keeping my voice level. Her lips pressed thin. "Do you know it's against HOA guidelines to feed stray animals? It encourages infestations, disease," and she gestured toward the dogs with a dramatic flair. "This kind of unsanitary behavior." I glanced back at Emma, who was giggling as Rusty wagged his tail. "She's just a kid and they're just hungry. They're not hurting anyone." Karen's eyes narrowed. "That's how it starts. Today it's dogs. Tomorrow it's raccoons, coyotes, who knows what else. Rules exist for a reason." I swallowed the retort that rose to my tongue. I could have told her that rules without compassion are cages. I could have told her that Emma's small joy was worth more than the sterile perfection of manicured lawns. But I knew Karen wouldn't hear it. Her world was built on control, and kindness was a crack in the foundation she couldn't allow. Instead, I said simply, "Have a good evening, Karen." Her eyes flicked to Emma, then back to me. "This isn't over." And with that, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the pavement like the ticking of a clock counting down to an inevitable confrontation. That night, as I tucked Emma into bed, she asked me why Ms. Karen always looked so angry. "Some people," I said gently, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead, "forget what it feels like to be kind. Maybe they're too busy worrying about rules or appearances or things that don't really matter. But that's not your fault, sweetheart. You just keep being you." She smiled drowsily. "I like the dogs. They make me happy." And as her eyes fluttered closed, I realized something. The dogs weren't just her happiness. They were her way of claiming power in a world that often tried to strip it from her. In feeding them, she was feeding her own spirit, proving that despite her limitations, she could give something vital, love. But even as I watched her sleep, I couldn't shake the unease that settled in my chest. Karen wasn't going to let this go. And while Emma's innocence shielded her from the storm gathering on the horizon, I could see the dark clouds already forming. For now, though, I allowed myself to linger in the peace of the moment, the soft sound of Emma's breathing, the memory of her laughter with the dogs, the fragile beauty of a quiet night in a neighborhood pretending to be perfect. It was peaceful, too peaceful. And peace, I knew from experience, never lasts forever. The first time Karen made her hostility official was through paper. A folded letter, neatly typed and tucked into an envelope bearing the HOA logo, appeared in our mailbox. I found it early one morning while sipping my coffee on the porch, the sky just beginning to brighten with streaks of pale orange. At first glance, I assumed it was a routine notice about lawn maintenance or scheduled neighborhood cleanups. But when I opened it, my chest tightened. The letter was addressed to me directly, but the words were soaked with Karen's venom. "Dear resident, it has come to the attention of the HOA that your household has been engaging in activity that violates community regulations. Specifically, feeding stray animals has been observed on multiple occasions. This creates an environment conducive to infestation, disease, and potential harm to other residents. Effective immediately, you are required to cease this behavior. Continued violations will result in fines and possible legal escalation. Respectfully, the Homeowners Association." At the bottom of the letter, beneath the official printed signature line, someone had scrawled in neat cursive, "You've been warned." It wasn't hard to guess whose handwriting that was. When I showed the letter to Emma, she frowned in confusion. "But why don't they want the dogs to eat? They're hungry." I crouched beside her wheelchair and forced a smile I didn't feel. "Some people don't understand kindness, sweetheart. But don't you worry, I'll handle this." For the next few days, I tried. I attended the HOA meeting, sitting in the bland community center room with its flickering fluorescent lights and rows of metal chairs. Karen sat at the head of the table like a queen on her throne, papers stacked neatly before her. "Feeding stray dogs is not only against the rules," she announced with a smile too tight to be genuine, "but it's dangerous. We have children in this neighborhood. We can't risk them being attacked by wild animals that have been encouraged to linger." I raise my hand, trying to keep calm. First of all, the dogs aren't wild. They're strays. There's a difference. And second, they're not dangerous. My daughter feeds them every evening. They're gentle with her, and they never cause trouble. Karen's smile didn't falter, but her eyes hardened. Perhaps your daughter doesn't see the danger, but we adults must look at the bigger picture. This is about safety and cleanliness. If you want pets, you can adopt them properly like everyone else. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room, though I noticed a few neighbors shifting uncomfortably in their chairs. They weren't all on her side, but they weren't willing to stand against her either. I leaned forward, my voice steady. This isn't about pets. It's about compassion. My daughter is disabled, and feeding those dogs gives her joy, purpose, and connection. Surely this community can make room for that. For a moment, silence hung in the air. Then Karen tapped her pen against the table and said, "Rules are rules." The meeting moved on, but I could feel her victory in the room. When I returned home that evening, Emma was waiting on the porch with her bag of food in her lap. "Did they say it's okay?" she asked hopefully. I hesitated, hating the weight of the truth. "Not exactly. But don't worry, we'll figure this out." She nodded slowly, then wheeled herself down the driveway anyway. Shadow padded out from the trees, wagging his tail. Emma's face lit up. Watching her, I knew no HOA could take this from her. But Karen wasn't done. The next confrontation came 2 nights later. I was in the kitchen washing dishes when I heard Emma scream. I dropped the plate, soap and water splashing across the counter, and bolted for the front door. Emma was at the edge of the driveway, her wheelchair angled awkwardly as though she'd been startled. Karen stood a few feet away, pointing at the strays as if they were criminals. "You're breaking the rules," she shouted, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Do you have any idea what diseases these animals carry? They could bite. They could kill." Emma's hands shook as she tried to explain. "They're nice. They don't hurt me." I rushed forward, placing myself between Karen and my daughter. My blood boiled, but I forced my tone to remain calm. "Back off, Karen. She's not hurting anyone." Karen's lips curled. "If you won't discipline your child, then I will. These mutts are disgusting, and she's making things worse. If I have to call animal control, I will." Emma's eyes filled with tears. Rusty whimpered from a few feet away, confused by the shouting. My heart clenched at the sight. "That's enough," I said firmly. "You're scaring her." Karen jabbed a finger toward me. "You've been warned. If this continues, you'll regret it." She stormed off into the night, her footsteps echoing like the pounding of a war drum. That evening, Emma barely touched her dinner. She sat quietly, her fork pushing food around her plate. Finally, she whispered, "Why does she hate the dogs so much?" I sighed, fighting the heaviness pressing down on me. "Because some people are afraid of what they don't understand. But you're not wrong, Emma. You're kind. Don't let her make you think otherwise." But I could see the fear lingering in her eyes, the way her shoulders hunched slightly as if bracing for another attack. Karen had planted a seed of doubt, and I hated her for it. Over the next week, things escalated further. We found another letter, this time a fine notice, $100 for violating HOA animal policies. Then another, and another. Each one stacked like bricks on a wall Karen was building between us and the rest of the community. Neighbors began to avoid eye contact when we passed. Some whispered as we walked by, though a few offered sympathetic smiles when Karen wasn't looking. The strays still came every night, tails wagging, eyes hopeful. But now, every time Emma fed them, she glanced nervously toward the street, afraid Karen might appear again. One Saturday afternoon, we returned from a grocery store to find a flyer taped to our front door. In bold black letters, it read, "Stop feeding the dogs before someone gets hurt." My fists clenched around the paper until it crumpled. Someone, likely Karen, had crossed the line from intimidation to outright threat. I sat Emma down at the table, showing her the flyer. "Sweetheart, I think we need to take a break from feeding the dogs for a little while, at least until things calm down." Her face crumpled. "But they'll be hungry." "I know," I said softly. Your safety comes first." She shook her head fiercely, tears streaming down her cheeks. "They need me, Mom. If I don't feed them, who will?" The fierceness in her voice broke my heart. This wasn't just about dogs anymore. It was about her need to matter, to give something only she could give. And I realized Karen wasn't just threatening animals. She was threatening Emma's spirit. That night, as I tucked Emma into bed, I made a silent vow. I didn't know how yet, but I would protect her joy, her kindness, and her right to be exactly who she was. Because Karen had underestimated something crucial. This wasn't just about rules, fines, or strays. This was about a mother's love, and that was a battle she couldn't win. The first cool winds of autumn had begun to weave through the neighborhood, rattling the leaves that clung stubbornly to the trees. Emma loved this time of year, the crunch of leaves beneath her wheels, the scent of wood smoke from chimneys, and the way Rusty, Shadow, and Snowball would bound toward her as though she were the center of their universe. To her, fall meant warmth, even as the air grew cold. But to Karen, it seemed fall meant only one thing: escalation. For a brief moment, I thought maybe things would settle. After the threatening flyer and the fines, we heard nothing for nearly a week. Emma began to relax again, though she still glanced nervously toward Karen's house every evening. I tried to reassure her. "See, maybe she's finally realized she can't stop you." I wanted to believe it myself, but peace in this neighborhood had a way of feeling like the stillness before a storm. The storm came one Sunday evening. Emma had begged me all afternoon to let her feed the dogs again. I hesitated, torn between protecting her from Karen's wrath and allowing her the joy she so desperately needed. At last, I gave in. We filled her lap with kibble and leftover chicken, and she wheeled herself to the edge of the driveway as the streetlights flickered on. The dogs emerged from the shadows as usual, tails wagging, eyes soft. Emma's laughter rang out like music, shattering the tension that had hung over us for days. I leaned against the porch railing, smiling despite myself. For a moment, everything felt normal again, until headlights swept across the cul-de-sac. A car slowed, then stopped directly in front of our house. Karen stepped out, her heels clicking against the pavement, her face twisted with a fury I hadn't seen before. She wasn't just angry, she was unhinged. "What did I tell you?" she shrieked, striding toward Emma. "I warned you. I warned both of you." Emma froze, her hands trembling as she clutched the bag of food. The dogs backed away, sensing danger. "Karen, that's enough," I called sharply, moving down the steps. "You need to calm down." "Calm down." Her laugh was high-pitched, brittle. "I've had enough of this. You think the rules don't apply to you? You think your sob story gives you special treatment? Not in my neighborhood. Not on my watch." Before I could respond, she reached into her purse. My breath caught when I saw what she pulled out, a small handgun gleaming under the street lamp. Emma gasped, her eyes wide with terror. "Mom," everything in me went cold. My body moved before my mind caught up, placing myself between Karen and my daughter. "Put the gun down, Karen." I shouted, my voice shaking with rage. Karen's hand trembled, but her eyes burned with conviction. "These dogs are a menace. And you," she pointed the gun at me, then at Emma, "you're teaching her to break the rules. If the HOA won't do something, then I will." The neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. Lights flickered on in nearby houses, curtains twitched, shadows shifted as neighbors peeked out, drawn by the shouting. But no one stepped forward. No one intervened. "Karen, listen to me," I said, my voice low but firm. "You're scaring a child. My child. This isn't about dogs anymore, is it? This is about control. But you don't get to threaten her." Emma whimpered, tears streaking her cheeks. "Please don't hurt them," she whispered, her voice breaking. For a flicker of a moment, Karen hesitated. But then, as Rusty barked nervously from the edge of the street, she snapped. Her arm jerked upward, the gun aimed in the direction of the dogs. And then bang! The sound split the night like thunder. Emma screamed. The dogs scattered, yelping and scrambling back into the shadows. My heart slammed against my ribs as adrenaline surged through me. "Are you insane?" I roared, lunging forward. My hands closed around her wrist, forcing the barrel skyward. We struggled, her face contorted with rage and fear. She fought like a cornered animal, but I wasn't just a parent in that moment. I was a protector, a shield, and no one threatened my child. Neighbors poured onto their porches now, gasps echoing through the cul-de-sac. Someone shouted to call the police. Another yelled for her to stop. But Karen thrashed wildly, her fingers still twitching near the trigger. I twisted her wrist, the gun clattering onto the pavement. I kicked it away, my chest heaving. Karen stumbled back, her hair disheveled, her face flushed. For the first time, I saw something new in her eyes. Not anger, not self-righteousness, but fear. Emma sobbed behind me, her hands covering her ears. I crouched beside her, cupping her face. "You're okay, sweetheart. You're safe. I promise." But even as I comforted her, my own body shook with fury. Because Karen hadn't just threatened dogs. She hadn't just broken HOA rules or issued fines. She had pointed a gun at my child, my disabled, defenseless daughter, and pulled the trigger without care for the life she might take. And that was the moment Karen's war with us stopped being a neighborhood squabble. It became personal. The wail of sirens grew louder, blue and red lights flashing against the pristine facades of houses. Police cars screeched into the cul-de-sac, officers pouring out with weapons drawn. Neighbors scattered back into their homes like frightened rabbits, though some lingered at their windows, watching the spectacle unfold. Karen raised her hands, shouting incoherently. I was protecting the neighborhood. They wouldn't listen. Those dogs are dangerous. But the officers weren't listening to her excuses. They moved swiftly, pinning her against her car, reading her rights. Her protests rang through the air, desperate and shrill. Emma clung to me, her body trembling. I held her close, whispering soothing words. I barely believed myself. My own hands shook as the adrenaline ebbed, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion and a fury that simmered hotter than ever. One of the officers approached me, his face grim. "Ma'am, we'll need a statement. Are you and your daughter all right?" I nodded stiffly, though my voice cracked when I spoke. She pointed a gun at my daughter. She fired. "You need to make sure she never comes near us again." The officer's jaw tightened. "We'll handle it." But as I looked down at Emma's tear-streaked face, I knew handling it wasn't enough. Karen had shown her true nature. She wasn't just a petty tyrant with HOA power, she was dangerous. And though the law would take its course, I knew this wasn't over. Because there was one thing Karen didn't know. She had no idea who I was or what I was capable of when it came to protecting my child, and she was about to find out. The police cruiser's taillights disappeared into the night, carrying Karen away in handcuffs, but her presence lingered like a storm cloud that refused to pass. The neighborhood was quiet now, eerily so, as though every house held its breath. Curtains that had twitched moments earlier fell still. Porch lights flicked off one by one, leaving only the glow of the street lamp spilling across the pavement where the gun still lay, bagged and tagged by the officers. Emma leaned against me, her small frame trembling. She hadn't spoken since the shot rang out. I could feel her heart pounding against my side, rapid and uneven. I kissed the top of her head, whispering, "You're safe. I've got you." But deep inside, a fire raged. Karen had crossed the line. And not just a line, it was the one line no one could ever cross with me, threatening my child. The officers had taken our statements, jotting everything into neat little notepads, promising charges of reckless endangerment, discharging a firearm in a residential area, and more. But as I closed the door behind them, I knew better than to place my faith in the system alone. People like Karen had a way of slipping through cracks, of twisting rules and loopholes to wriggle out unscathed. And even if she faced justice, that didn't erase the fear she had carved into Emma's heart. That was when I realized it was time to stop playing the polite parent, the quiet neighbor. It was time to remind Karen and the entire neighborhood exactly who I was. For years, I had lived here in relative anonymity, content to let the manicured lawns and HOA newsletters drown out my past. I was simply Emma's mom, the woman who worked odd hours from home and kept mostly to herself. No one asked questions, and I offered no answers. But My life before this cul-de-sac had been something very different. I hadn't always been quiet. I hadn't always been ordinary. Long before I traded tactical gear for gardening gloves, I had worn the uniform of the U.S. Army. I had led missions, negotiated hostile standoffs, and seen the raw face of humanity at its worst. Later, I had shifted into law, specializing in cases involving abuse, neglect, and the vulnerable. I had made a career out of standing up for those who couldn't stand for themselves. And yet here, I had let a woman like Karen intimidate my daughter. That thought made my stomach churn. No more. The next morning, I put on clothes I hadn't worn in years, not the uniform itself, but something that carried the same energy: pressed slacks, a fitted blazer, polished shoes. I wanted authority to radiate off me like heat. I wanted every neighbor who had whispered behind blinds to see me not as just a mom, but as someone who had fought battles far greater than HOA disputes. I wheeled Emma out beside me, her small hand gripping mine. She looked at me curiously. "Where are we going?" "Community center," I said. "It's time we had a talk with the neighborhood." Word of the incident had already spread like wildfire. By the time we arrived, the parking lot buzzed with voices, clusters of neighbors huddled in anxious conversation. Some glanced at me with sympathy, others with avoidance. All of them fell silent, however, when I stepped inside with Emma at my side. Karen wasn't there, still in custody, I assumed, but her allies were. I spotted the tight-lipped treasurer of the HOA, the secretary, who always nodded dutifully at Karen's commands, and several neighbors who had signed their names on fine notices. Their eyes narrowed when they saw me. I didn't wait for the meeting to start. I walked straight to the front of the room, turned to face the crowd, and spoke. "Last night, my daughter was nearly shot because she chose compassion over cruelty." A ripple of discomfort moved through the room. Some people looked away. Others shifted uneasily in their seats. Karen has spent months harassing us, issuing fines, spreading lies, and threatening a 14-year-old girl whose only crime was feeding hungry animals. And last night, she pulled a gun. My voice sharpened. "On my child." Gasps echoed. A few people whispered, "She really had a gun?" I raised my chin, letting my gaze sweep across the room. Yes, she pulled a trigger. That bullet could have killed one of those dogs or my daughter or any of your children if they'd been nearby. That's not leadership. That's terrorism. The treasurer cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. Let's not exaggerate. Exaggerate. I snapped. My voice cracked like a whip. I served in combat zones overseas. I know the sound of a gunshot. I know the weight of what it means to fire a weapon. And I can tell you, what Karen did was not a misunderstanding. It was an act of violence. The room went silent again. Even the secretary, usually glued to Karen's side, stared down at her notepad, refusing to meet my eyes. Emma squeezed my hand, her voice small but steady. "I just wanted to help the dogs." Her words cut through the tension like a blade. Neighbors shifted uncomfortably. A few women dabbed at their eyes. One man muttered, "She's just a kid." I took a deep breath and continued, my voice firm but steady. "This community has allowed one person's obsession with control to poison everything. She claims it's about rules, but last night proved it's not. It's about power. And when someone abuses power, it's up to the rest of us to stop them." I let the silence hang for a beat before adding, "So let me be very clear. I am not afraid of her. I am not afraid of anyone who threatens my daughter. I've faced men with bombs strapped to their chests, warlords with armies at their backs, criminals with nothing to lose. Compared to them, Karen is nothing. But she still managed to make my daughter cry. And for that, I will see this through to the very end." The crowd murmured, the tide beginning to shift. Some nodded. Others clapped quietly. One older woman near the back stood and said, "She's right. We've let Karen bully us for too long." The momentum built. A young father raised his hand. "My kids play outside every day. If she fired a gun once, what's to stop her from doing it again?" Another voice chimed in. "She doesn't speak for all of us. She never has." For the first time since moving into this neighborhood, I felt the balance of power tilt. Karen's iron grip had slipped the moment she crossed the line from fines to firearms, and now her followers were scrambling to distance themselves. I straightened, my voice steady. I'll be pressing charges. I'll also be filing a motion to remove her from the HOA board permanently. And I expect every parent, every neighbor who values safety and compassion to stand with me. Applause broke out, not thunderous but strong enough to echo, strong enough to matter. Emma smiled through her tears, leaning into me. You were amazing, Mom. I kissed her forehead. No, sweetheart. You were. You never let her stop you from being kind. That's stronger than anything I could do. But deep inside, I knew this wasn't the end. Karen would fight back, people like her always did. She'd lawyer up, twist the narrative, try to paint herself as the victim. She might even return, angrier than before. But now, the neighborhood had seen the truth. They had seen who she really was, and who I really was. Karen had wanted control. Instead, she had awakened a side of me I had kept buried. And I wasn't about to let it go back to sleep. The days that followed were unlike anything the neighborhood had ever seen. Karen's arrest had spread beyond our gated community, splashing across local news headlines. HOA board member arrested after firing gun in residential area. Her smug, perfectly composed facade was replaced with a mugshot that revealed the cracks she had tried so hard to hide. Disheveled hair, wild eyes, and the unmistakable expression of a woman who had lost control. For the first time in years, the community walked with their heads held a little higher. Conversations bloomed on sidewalks, not in whispers, but in voices loud enough to be heard. Parents waved to me, neighbors stopped to ask about Emma, and even those who had once turned away in silence now offered words of support. It was as if Karen's downfall had lifted a weight none of us realized we were carrying. But behind the smiles and polite nods, I carried my own storm. The sound of that gunshot still echoed in my chest. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw Emma's terrified face, her trembling hands, the tears streaking down her cheeks. The thought that she could have been taken from me in that moment clawed at my insides. I had seen death in battlefields, watched comrades fall beside me, but nothing had ever cut as deep as the fear of losing her. That fear was the reason I refused to let Karen slip back into her old life. The morning after the community meeting, I met with the district attorney. Sitting across from him in his office, I laid out every detail: the harassment, the fines, the threats, the flyer taped to our door, and finally the shot fired into the night. My voice never wavered. My training had taught me how to deliver testimony with precision, and I poured that precision into every word. When I finished, the DA leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. There's no question this is serious. With your testimony and your daughter's, we'll have no trouble pressing charges. Reckless endangerment, unlawful discharge of a firearm, and intimidation. She won't walk away from this. Good, I said flatly, because if she does, she'll come back. He studied me for a moment, then nodded. We'll make sure she doesn't. Meanwhile, the HOA scrambled to salvage what little credibility it had left. Within days, an emergency board meeting was held. I attended not out of obligation, but because I wanted to look each one of them in the eye. The room was quieter than I had ever seen it, the air heavy with shame. Karen's seat sat empty, a silent reminder of the chaos she had wrought. The treasurer cleared his throat nervously. Effective immediately, Karen has been removed from the board. We'll be holding elections next month to fill her position. I raised my hand. And what about the fines? The harassment? The written threats? The secretary shifted uncomfortably. We will be reviewing all of that. Any fines issued against your household will be rescinded. And going forward, the board will be drafting new policies that prioritize both community safety and compassion. It wasn't an admission of guilt, but it was close enough. For once, they weren't hiding behind clipboards and technicalities. They were afraid, and they should have been. When the meeting ended, neighbors approached me in small groups. One woman hugged me tightly. I'm so sorry. We should have stood up to her sooner. Another man nodded solemnly. You did what we couldn't. But the truth was, I hadn't done it alone. Emma had. Her kindness had been the spark, the thing Karen couldn't crush no matter how hard she tried. That night, I found Emma sitting on the porch, staring out into the dark where the dogs usually appeared. They hadn't come back since the gunshot, and I could see the sadness in her eyes. Do you think they'll ever come again? She asked softly. I knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. They're scared right now. But dogs are smart, sweetheart. They know you love them. They'll come back when they're ready. She nodded, though her shoulders slumped. For Emma, the dogs weren't just companions. They were proof that her kindness mattered in a world that sometimes tried to ignore her. And as if the universe had heard her silent plea, the sound of paws scratching against gravel reached us. From the shadows, Rusty emerged first, his tail wagging cautiously. Behind him came Shadow and Snowball, their eyes reflecting in the porch light. Emma gasped, her face lighting up. They came back. She reached for the bag of kibble we had set aside, her hands shaking with excitement as she scattered food across the driveway. The dogs bounded forward, tails wagging, eyes full of trust. For the first time since that horrible night, Emma laughed. The sound was like sunlight breaking through clouds. I sat beside her, watching the scene unfold, my chest swelling with pride. Karen had tried to steal this moment from her. She had tried to turn joy into fear, kindness into crime. But she had failed, and in failing, she had revealed the truth. Cruelty is always weaker than compassion. Weeks later, Karen's trial began. I sat in the courtroom, Emma by my side, as the prosecutor laid out the case. Karen sat hunched at the defense table, her once perfect composure shattered. She tried to argue she had acted out of concern for the community, but the jury saw through it. They heard Emma's trembling voice describe the fear she felt when the gun was raised. They saw the flyer, the letters, the record of fines. They listened as neighbors admitted they had felt bullied into silence. The verdict came swiftly, guilty on all counts. Karen was sentenced to several years in prison, stripped of her position, her reputation in ruins. As the gavel struck, Emma squeezed my hand, whispering, "It's over." And in that moment, I believed her. Life slowly returned to normal. The dogs became regular fixtures again, no longer hiding in the shadows. Neighbors stopped by to drop off treats for them, some even offering to help care for them. A few families adopted the strays, giving them warm beds and safe homes. Rusty, however, remained with us, refusing to leave Emma's side. He had chosen her, just as she had chosen him. On quiet evenings, I would sit on the porch, watching Emma laugh as Rusty rested his head in her lap. The memory of the gunshot still lingered, but it no longer held power over us. We had survived, we had won, and as I looked at my daughter, her face glowing with happiness, I realized something profound. Karen had tried to break us, but in doing so, she had only made us stronger. She had reminded me of who I was, of the strength I carried not just as a veteran, not just as a lawyer, but as a mother. And she had reminded Emma that kindness, even in the face of cruelty, is a force no one can extinguish. The HOA's rules still hung on the bulletin boards, neatly typed and laminated. But now they were just words. Because the neighborhood had changed. We had changed it. Justice had been served. Peace had been restored. And Emma, my brave, kind, extraordinary daughter, had proven that sometimes the smallest acts of love can topple the tallest walls of hate. If this story struck a chord with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to HOA Denied Access. We bring you real, raw, and emotional stories where the truth always comes out, and justice always finds its way. Join our community today, so you never miss what happens when the powerful get put in their place.